The fluorescent lights in the radiology waiting room buzzed like angry wasps, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional yellow that made healthy people look sick and sick people look like they were already halfway to the grave. Maya Chen sat rigid in the uncomfortable plastic chair, her neck held at an unnatural angle, supported by a foam collar that smelled faintly of antiseptic and other people's pain. Her fingers traced the edges of the manila envelope containing her x-rays, the ones her stepmother Diane had insisted were completely unnecessary and just another one of Maya's dramatic episodes. The pain had been constant for 3 weeks now, ever since that Tuesday evening when Diane's perfectly manicured hand had connected with the back of Maya's neck, in what the family had unanimously decided to call an unfortunate accident during a heated discussion about college applications. Maya's father, Richard, had been in his study, door closed, classical music drowning out the raised voices in the kitchen. Her younger half-brother Tommy had been upstairs, gaming headset on, lost in digital worlds where problems could be solved with respawn buttons and extra lives. Maya Chen? The voice belonged to Dr. Sarah Martinez, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of calm demeanor that suggested she'd seen enough human misery to have developed a professional armor against it, but not so much that she'd lost her capacity for genuine concern. Maya stood carefully, the movement sending a sharp reminder through her cervical vertebrae that something was decidedly wrong. She followed Dr. Martinez down a hallway, lined with motivational posters about wellness and recovery, past examination rooms where she could hear muffled conversations between doctors and patients, snippets of medical terminology mixed with reassurances and concerns. The office was small but warm, with a window that looked out onto a courtyard where someone had planted roses that were just beginning to bloom despite the early spring chill. Dr. Martinez gestured to a chair across from her desk, and Maya settled into it with the cheerful precision of someone who had learned to move through the world as if it were made of glass. "I've reviewed your imaging studies," Dr. Martinez said, pulling up the x-rays on her computer screen. The ghostly white shapes of Maya's bones appeared, floating in digital space, like archaeological artifacts waiting to tell their story. "Before we discuss what I'm seeing, I'd like you to tell me exactly what happened, in your own words. Take your time." Maya had told this story before, to her father, to Diane, to the urgent care doctor who had initially dismissed her concerns with a prescription for ibuprofen and advice to take it easy for a few days. Each telling had been met with variations of the same response. Accidents happen. Families work through these things. No one is perfect. Maybe Maya was being oversensitive. Perhaps she should consider how her accusations might affect the family dynamic, especially with Tommy watching. But something in Dr. Martinez's tone was different. There was no hurry in her voice, no underlying current of skepticism or the particular brand of exhaustion that comes from dealing with what people assumed was teenage drama. She was listening not just to the words Maya might say, but to the spaces between them, the things that couldn't be spoken directly. Maya began slowly. The argument had started over her college choice. She wanted to study journalism at a school 3 hours away, while Diane insisted she should stay local and study something more practical, more stable. The discussion had moved from the dinner table to the kitchen, voices rising with the steam from the dishwater. Diane had been loading the dishwasher with more force than necessary, plates clattering against each other like verbal punctuation marks. "She said I was being ungrateful," Maya continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "that she'd done everything she could to be a good mother to me since she married Dad 5 years ago. And this was how I repaid her kindness. I told her she wasn't my mother, and that's when—" Maya's hand moved instinctively to her neck. Dr. Martinez nodded, making notes without looking away from Maya's face. "What exactly happened next?"
She turned around fast, really fast, and her hand caught me right here. Maya indicated the spot at the base of her skull where her neck curved. But it wasn't like a slap. It was more like she grabbed and twisted at the same time. The pain was immediate, but she said it was an accident, that she was just turning around and I was standing too close. And when I started crying, she got even angrier and said I was being dramatic. The room fell quiet, except for the soft hum of the computer and the distant sound of traffic outside the window. Dr. Martinez pulled up another view of the x-rays, this one showing Maya's neck from a different angle. "Maya," she said carefully, "what I'm seeing here is consistent with a very specific type of injury. The alignment of your cervical vertebrae shows signs of forced rotation and hyperextension. This isn't the kind of injury you get from accidentally bumping into someone or from sleeping wrong, which is what your initial medical report suggests someone told the urgent care physician." Maya felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of a knot she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. For 3 weeks, she had begun to doubt her own memory, her own pain, her own right to feel that something terrible had happened to her. "Are you saying," Maya started, then stopped, afraid to finish the sentence. "I'm saying that your injury is consistent with deliberate force applied in a specific way. And I'm also saying that as a medical professional, I have certain obligations when I see evidence of potential abuse." Dr. Martinez leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but firm. "Maya, what I'm about to tell you might feel overwhelming, but I need you to understand that you're not alone in this, and you're not wrong about what happened to you." Maya's eyes filled with tears that she'd been holding back for weeks. In her family, tears were seen as manipulation, as evidence of instability, as something to be managed rather than acknowledged. But here, in this small office with roses blooming outside the window, her tears felt like something else entirely, like relief, like validation, like the first breath after being underwater too long. Dr. Martinez handed her a box of tissues and waited while Maya composed herself. There are people whose job it is to help in situations like this: social workers, counselors, legal advocates. But first, we need to make sure you're safe. Are you living in the same house as the person who hurt you? Maya nodded, suddenly aware of how small and vulnerable that made her seem. "And have there been other incidents? Other times when you've been hurt or threatened?" Maya thought about the pattern that had emerged over the past 2 years. The way Diane's anger seemed to escalate when Richard wasn't around. The careful choreography of family dinners where Maya had learned to make herself smaller and quieter. The way bruises on her arms were explained away as clumsiness. The gradual isolation from friends who asked too many questions about why Maya couldn't hang out after school anymore. "It's complicated," Maya said finally. "She's never hurt Tommy. Just me. And she's really good at making it seem like I'm the problem, like I'm the one who starts things or makes everything difficult. My dad thinks she's wonderful. He says she's the best thing that ever happened to our family after my mom died." Dr. Martinez made more notes, her expression growing more serious. "Maya, I want you to know that what you're describing is a pattern that trained professionals recognize. Abusers often target one person in a household while maintaining positive relationships with others. It's a way of maintaining control and ensuring that their version of events will be believed." Through the window, Maya could see a maintenance worker tending to the rose garden, carefully pruning dead growth to make room for new blooms. She wondered what it would feel like to have someone care for her with that same patient attention, removing the damaged parts so that healthy growth could take their place. "What happens now?" Maya asked. Dr. Martinez explained the process, the report that would need to be filed, the social worker who would be assigned to Maya's case, the investigation that would follow. She also explained Maya's options, the resources available to her, and the ways that medical professionals and social services could work together to ensure her safety. "I know this feels scary," Dr. Martinez said. "Change always does. But Maya, what I see in these x-rays tells a story that needs to be heard by people who can do something about it.
Your neck is going to heal, but the pattern of behavior that caused this injury, that needs to be addressed before it escalates. As Maya left the radiology office that afternoon, she carried with her not just the medical documentation of her injury, but something more precious: the knowledge that her pain was real, that her experience was valid, and that there were adults in the world who would listen to her truth without trying to minimize it or explain it away. She didn't yet know how difficult the path ahead would be, or how many times she would have to tell her story before it was finally heard by the right people. But for the first time in months, she felt like she wasn't carrying the weight of her family's dysfunction alone. The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor seemed less harsh now, and Maya realized that what she had mistaken for the color of sickness was actually something else entirely. It was the color of truth under scrutiny, of secrets being brought into the light, of the beginning of a story that would demand to be told completely, no matter how uncomfortable that might make the people who preferred their family narratives neat and uncomplicated. Maya walked toward the exit with her head held as high as her injured neck would allow, clutching the envelope of X-rays that would become the first piece of evidence in a case that would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone who had chosen to look away when looking would have made all the difference. Maya's bedroom had become her sanctuary and her prison in equal measure. The pale yellow walls that her mother had painted when Maya was 7, back when the house held different possibilities and laughter came more easily, now felt like the boundaries of a world that had grown smaller and more careful with each month since Diane had moved in. She sat at her desk attempting to focus on her AP English essay about the concept of truth in literature, but the irony wasn't lost on her. How could she write about fictional characters discovering difficult truths when she was living in a house where truth was treated like a dangerous substance that needed to be contained and neutralized before it could cause any real damage? The house itself seemed to hold its breath around Diane. She had learned to read its moods through the sound of footsteps on the hardwood floors. Richard's steps were heavy and purposeful, the stride of a man who believed that good intentions and hard work could solve any problem. Tommy's steps were light and quick, the rhythm of someone who had learned to navigate family tension by staying in motion. But Diane's steps were different, measured and deliberate when others were around, but sharp and agitated when she thought she was alone with Maya.
The kindness in Maya was something that both sustained her and made her vulnerable. When Tommy struggled with his math homework, she helped him without being asked, even though it meant staying up later to finish her own work. When Richard seemed stressed about work, she made him his favorite tea and left it on his desk with a note telling him she believed in him. When Diane complained about how difficult it was to manage a household with teenagers, Maya cleaned the bathrooms without being asked and organized the pantry in the way Diane preferred. This kindness, Maya was beginning to understand, had been weaponized against her. Diane had learned to interpret Maya's gestures of goodwill as evidence that Maya knew she was at fault for the family's problems. Each act of service became proof that Maya was trying to make amends for her supposed difficult behavior rather than what it actually was, the desperate attempt of a teenager to earn love and safety through perfection. Maya's dreams had always been vivid, but lately they had taken on a cinematic quality that left her feeling exhausted upon waking. In one recurring dream, she was trying to pack for college, but every time she folded something and placed it in her suitcase, it would unfold itself. No matter how carefully she arranged her belongings, they would return to chaos the moment she looked away. She would wake from these dreams with her heart racing and her neck aching, as if even in sleep she couldn't escape the hypervigilance that had become her default state. Her fears weren't just about physical safety, though that was certainly part of it. Maya was afraid of who she was becoming in response to the constant stress. She caught herself becoming suspicious of kindness from others, wondering what they might want in return. She found herself calculating the emotional cost of every interaction, every request for help from friends, every invitation to participate in activities that might put her in conflict with Diane's expectations. The worst part was how reasonable it all seemed from the outside.
Diane never raised her voice in front of Richard or Tommy. She never left marks that would be visible to others. She had perfected the art of plausible deniability, the comment that could be interpreted as concern rather than criticism, the physical contact that looked affectionate to observers but felt threatening to Maya. The way she could make Maya's perfectly reasonable requests seem selfish and ungrateful. Maya's relationship with her father had become one of the most painful aspects of her situation. Richard was a good man who loved his daughter deeply, but he had also been lonely for years after Maya's mother died, and Diane had filled that loneliness with what seemed like miraculous efficiency. She cooked his favorite meals, organized his closet, remembered the birthdays of his colleagues, and created the kind of domestic harmony that had been missing from their house since Maya's mother's death from cancer 6 years earlier. Richard saw Diane's treatment of Maya as the normal growing pains of blended family life. When Maya tried to talk to him about her concerns, he listened with the patient expression of someone who believed that time and good intentions would solve all problems. He would acknowledge that the adjustment was difficult for everyone, remind Maya that Diane was doing her best in a challenging situation, and suggest that Maya try to be more understanding of Diane's position. The most heartbreaking part was that Richard's advice wasn't wrong exactly. Diane was in a difficult position. She had married a man with a teenage daughter who was still grieving her mother's death. She was trying to create stability for a family that had been shaped by loss. But Maya was beginning to understand that the difficulty of Diane's position didn't negate the reality of her own experience, and that understanding someone's motivations didn't require accepting their harmful behavior. Maya's memories of her mother had taken on new significance in recent months. Elena Chen had been a social worker who specialized in family therapy. She had talked to Maya about conflict resolution, about the importance of speaking up for yourself, about recognizing the difference between compromise and capitulation. Elena would have seen through Diane's tactics immediately. Maya was certain of that. But Elena was gone, and Maya was left to navigate this complex emotional terrain without the guidance of the one person who would both understand the situation and had the authority to address it. The flashbacks to her mother weren't always sad. Sometimes Maya remembered Elena's laugh, the way she would dance around the kitchen while making dinner, humming songs in both English and Mandarin. Elena had taught Maya that her mixed heritage was something to be proud of, that she didn't have to choose between the different parts of her identity. But Diane
had made it clear that Maya's connection to her mother's culture was something that made the family dinners awkward and her college applications unnecessarily complicated. Maya had stopped speaking Mandarin at home, had stopped making the dumplings her mother had taught her to prepare, had even removed some of her mother's photographs from her bedroom when Diane commented that it might be easier for everyone to move forward if we weren't constantly looking backward. Each of these concessions felt like a small betrayal of her mother's memory, but they also felt necessary for keeping the peace that everyone else seemed to value more than Maya's emotional well-being. At night, lying in bed with her neck propped on pillows to reduce the pain, Maya would practice the conversations she wished she could have with her father. She would explain how isolated she felt, how careful she had to be around Diane, how the constant vigilance was affecting her sleep and her schoolwork. In these imagined conversations, Richard would listen without interrupting, would ask thoughtful questions, would tell Maya that her feelings mattered and that changes needed to be made. But in real life, these conversations never went the way Maya hoped. Richard would listen for a few minutes, then redirect the discussion towards solutions that required Maya to modify her behavior rather than addressing Diane's. He would suggest that Maya try harder to appreciate Diane's efforts, that she consider how her attitude might be contributing to the tension, that she think about how lucky she was to have someone who cared enough to be involved in her life. Maya understood that her father's response came from love, but it was a love that asked her to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating. It was a love that prioritized harmony over honesty, that valued peace over protection. And Maya was beginning to realize that this kind of love, no matter how well-intentioned,
could be its own form of harm. The morning after her appointment with Dr. Martinez, Maya woke with a sense of possibility that felt almost foreign. For the first time in months, she had concrete evidence that her reality was real, that her pain was valid, and that her instincts about Diane's behavior were not the product of teenage drama or family adjustment difficulties. She had medical documentation and the promise of professional support, and these felt like tools she could use to build a different future. But she also woke with the knowledge that using these tools would require her to challenge a family narrative that everyone else found comfortable and functional. It would mean risking the stability that Richard valued so highly, potentially disrupting Tommy's sense of security, and almost certainly facing retaliation from Diane that could escalate beyond anything Maya had experienced so far. Maya got dressed carefully, choosing clothes that covered the fading bruises on her arms and wearing her hair in a way that concealed the marks on her neck from Diane's fingers. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and practiced the expression she would need to maintain through breakfast: neutral, cooperative, untroubled. She had become an expert at this performance, but this morning it felt different. This morning she was performing with full awareness that it was a performance, rather than trying to convince herself that this careful diminishment of her authentic self was simply maturity or family loyalty. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled like coffee and the vanilla candles that Diane preferred. Richard was reading the news on his tablet, occasionally sharing headlines that he found interesting or concerning. Tommy was eating cereal while scrolling through social media on his phone. Diane was wiping down counters that were already clean, her movements precise and purposeful. "Good morning, sweetheart," Richard said to Maya without looking up from his tablet. "How's the neck feeling?" Maya caught Diane's quick glance in her direction, a micro-expression that contained both warning and evaluation. "Better," Maya said carefully. "The doctor said it should heal completely with time." "That's wonderful news," Diane said, her voice bright with what sounded like genuine relief. "I've felt so terrible about that accident. I'm just glad you're okay." Maya poured herself orange juice and stood at the counter, marveling at how easily the narrative of accident and recovery could be maintained, how smoothly the family could return to normal functioning when everyone agreed to participate in the same fiction. But now she had different information, a different perspective, and the knowledge that there were people outside this kitchen who would be very interested in the true story behind her neck injury. "I should probably follow up with the doctor in a week or so," Maya said, testing the waters, just to make sure everything is healing properly. Richard nodded approvingly. "That sounds very responsible. It's always better to be cautious with these things." Diane's smile remained perfectly in place, but Maya noticed the way her hand tightened slightly around the dish rag she was holding. "Of course," Diane said. "Whatever the doctor recommends. We want to make sure you're completely healthy." Maya finished her juice and gathered her backpack and car keys. As she headed toward the door, Diane called after her. "Maya, honey, could you pick up some things from the grocery store on your way home? I'll text you a list." It was phrased as a request, but Maya understood it was something else entirely. It was a test, a way of ensuring that Maya understood her place in the family hierarchy and would continue to perform her role as the cooperative, helpful daughter who put family needs ahead of her own convenience. "Sure," Maya said. "No problem." As she backed out of the driveway, Maya caught sight of Diane in the kitchen window, watching her leave with an expression that Maya couldn't quite read, but that made her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. Maya drove toward school, thinking about the grocery store lists she would receive later, about the careful navigation required to complete Diane's errands without triggering criticism about the brand choices she made or the amount of money she spent, about the exhausting mental calculation required to anticipate and prevent potential conflicts. But she also thought about Dr. Martinez's kind eyes, about the x-rays that told the truth even when voices couldn't, about the social worker who would soon become part of Maya's story. She thought about the possibility of a future where grocery shopping could just be grocery shopping, where coming home didn't require emotional armor, where her kindness could be freely given rather than strategically deployed. Maya parked in the school lot and walked toward the building, her neck still tender, but her spine a little straighter than it had been in months. She was carrying two stories now, the family story that required her to be small and accommodating and grateful, and the true story that Dr. Martinez had helped her recognize and validate. Maya didn't yet know how these two stories would resolve themselves, but she was beginning to believe that she wouldn't have to carry the weight of their contradiction alone. The text from Diane arrived during Maya's third period chemistry class, causing her phone to buzz against her leg with the particular urgency that family communications seemed to carry. Maya glanced at the screen under her desk. Need to talk when you get home. Found some concerning things in your room while putting away laundry. Will discuss at 4 p.m. sharp. Maya's stomach dropped as she tried to remember what Diane might have discovered. She had been careful to hide the paperwork from Dr. Martinez, the pamphlets about domestic abuse that the radiologist had given her, the business card for the social services advocate. But Diane had a way of finding things that Maya thought were safely concealed, and she had no compunction about searching Maya's private spaces under the guise of household management. The rest of the school day passed in a blur of anxiety and preparation. Maya found herself mentally rehearsing explanations, trying to predict which version of Diane she would encounter when she got home, the reasonable stepmother who expressed concern for Maya's well-being, or the cold interrogator who treated Maya's privacy as evidence of suspicious behavior that needed to be investigated and controlled. At lunch, Maya sat with her friend Jessica, who immediately noticed her distracted state. Jessica had been Maya's closest friend since middle school, one of the few people who remembered what Maya had been like before Diane entered the picture. More confident, more spontaneous, less careful about every word and gesture.
"You look like you're about to throw up," Jessica said, unwrapping her sandwich with the casual efficiency of someone whose biggest daily concern was remembering to bring lunch money. "What's going on?" Maya wanted to tell her everything. She wanted to explain about the neck injury, about Dr. Martinez, about the investigation that was about to begin, about the constant vigilance required to navigate life in her house. But she also knew that involving Jessica would mean potentially putting her friend in an impossible position, asking her to keep secrets that might be too heavy for a 17-year-old to carry. "Just family stuff," Maya said instead. "You know how it is." But Jessica didn't know how it was, because Jessica's family operated on principles of basic respect and communication. When Jessica disagreed with her parents, they had conversations that might be frustrating or emotional, but they didn't involve physical intimidation or systematic undermining of Jessica's sense of reality. "Is it about college applications?" Jessica asked. "Because you know you're going to get into wherever you want to go, right? Your grades are amazing, your essays are incredible, and you've got all that newspaper and debate team leadership stuff." Maya managed to smile. Her college applications had become another battleground in the house, with Diane insisting that Maya was being unrealistic and selfish by wanting to go to school far from home. Each acceptance letter that arrived felt like both a victory and a source of increased tension, evidence that Maya had possibilities beyond the contained world that Diane seemed determined to maintain. "I hope so," Maya said. "I just need to get through the next few months." Jessica studied Maya's face with the intensity of someone who had known her long enough to recognize when she was holding back important information. "Maya, you know you can talk to me about anything, right? Like, anything. Even if it's really bad or really complicated or whatever." Maya felt tears threatening and forced herself to take a deep breath. "I know," she said, "and I promise I will. Soon. There are just some things I need to figure out first." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake Morrison, Jessica's boyfriend and Maya's debate team co-captain. Jake had the kind of easy confidence that came from growing up in a household where his opinions were valued and his achievements were celebrated without reservation. He was kind and smart and completely unaware of how much privilege was embedded in his ability to move through the world without calculating the potential consequences of every interaction. "Ladies," Jake said, sliding into the seat next to Jessica, "are we ready to demolish Jefferson High in the tournament next week? because I've been researching their arguments from last year, and I think I found some weaknesses we can exploit. Maya appreciated the distraction of talking about debate strategy, the intellectual challenge of constructing arguments and anticipating counterarguments. In debate, there were rules that everyone agreed to follow, judges who evaluated based on evidence and logical reasoning, a structure that rewarded truth-telling and penalized manipulation. It was the opposite of the dynamics that governed her home life, and she threw herself into the planning with more intensity than the situation required. Maya's been working on the opening statement, Jessica told Jake. Show him what you've got so far. Maya opened her notebook and began reading the argument she had constructed about the resolution that students should have greater input in school disciplinary policies. As she read, she became aware of the irony embedded in her words. She was arguing passionately for young people's right to be heard, to have their perspectives valued, to be treated as credible witnesses to their own experiences. She was making the case that adults in positions of authority had a responsibility to listen to students, even when those students were reporting uncomfortable truths about institutional failures.
Jake nodded approvingly as Maya finished reading. "This is really good," he said. "You've got solid evidence and the logical progression is clear. The other teams won't know what hit them." Maya felt a familiar surge of confidence that came from being recognized for her intellectual abilities. In this context, her ideas mattered, her voice had weight, her arguments could influence outcomes. But this confidence made the contrast with her home life even more stark. At school, she was someone whose thoughts and feelings were worthy of attention and respect. At home, she was someone whose pain could be dismissed as drama and whose concerns could be reframed as evidence of ingratitude or emotional instability. The final bell of the school day rang with the particular finality that Maya had learned to dread. She gathered her books slowly, delaying the inevitable drive home, the confrontation with Diane, the careful navigation of whatever trap had been set with the excuse of putting away laundry. Maya drove home through neighborhoods where other families were going about their normal evening routines. Kids playing in yards, parents walking dogs, teenagers laughing as they walked home from school. She envied the casualness of these interactions, the way these families seemed to exist without the undercurrent of tension that had become the soundtrack of her life. The house looked peaceful from the outside, its neat landscaping and fresh paint suggesting the kind of stability that Maya's father valued so highly. Richard's car was in the driveway, which meant he would be home for whatever discussion Diane had planned. Maya wasn't sure if this made things better or worse. Richard's presence might prevent Diane from escalating too dramatically, but it also meant that Maya would have to navigate the conversation with both of them, trying to maintain relationships that had become increasingly complicated and fraught. Maya entered through the front door and was immediately struck by the unusual quiet in the house. Normally, she could hear Tommy's music or video games, Richard's conference calls, the sounds of Diane moving through the house with her characteristic efficiency. But today, the silence felt deliberate and ominous. "Maya?" Diane's voice called from the living room. "Could you join us in here, please?" The formal tone, the use of us instead of me, the request that sounded more like a summons, all of this confirmed Maya's suspicion that she was walking into a carefully orchestrated confrontation. She dropped her backpack by the door and walked toward the living room, her neck already beginning to ache with the familiar tension that accompanied difficult conversations in this house. Richard was sitting in his usual chair, but instead of his normal relaxed posture, he was leaning forward with his hands clasped, wearing the expression he typically reserved for serious discussions about grades or curfews. Diane was standing by the fireplace, and spread across the coffee table were the papers that Maya had tried so hard to keep private: the medical documentation, the information about domestic abuse, the contact card for the social services advocate.
Maya felt the blood drain from her face as she realized the full scope of what Diane had discovered. These weren't just papers that could be explained away as school research or curiosity about social issues. These were documents that told a specific story about Maya's injury, about professional concerns for her safety, about resources available to teenagers in abusive situations. "Sit down, Maya," Richard said gently. "We need to talk about what's been going on." Maya perched on the couch, every muscle in her body tense with the anticipation of conflict. She tried to read her father's expression, to determine whether he was approaching this conversation from a place of concern for her well-being or frustration with what he might see as her disloyalty to the family. Diane picked up one of the pamphlets and held it at arm's length, as if it might contaminate her by proximity. "Maya, I found these hidden in your room along with some very concerning medical paperwork that suggests you've been telling people outside this family that I deliberately hurt you." The accusation hung in the air between them, and Maya realized that this was the moment she had been dreading and preparing for simultaneously. She could continue to participate in the family fiction that prioritized harmony over honesty, or she could tell the truth and face whatever consequences followed.
"I didn't hide anything," Maya said carefully. "I put those papers in my room because they're private medical documents, and I didn't tell anyone anything that wasn't true." Richard shifted in his chair, and Maya could see him trying to process information that challenged his understanding of their family dynamics. "Maya, the medical report suggests that your injury was caused by intentional force, but Diane has explained to both of us that it was an accident, that she'd turned around and you were standing too close. Are you saying that's not what happened?" Maya looked at her stepmother, who was standing perfectly still with an expression of hurt confusion that would have been convincing to anyone who hadn't lived through months of careful intimidation and manipulation. Diane had mastered the art of looking like a victim of unfair accusations, someone who had been trying her best in a difficult situation, only to be rewarded with suspicion and ingratitude. "That's not what happened," Maya said quietly. "She grabbed my neck and twisted it on purpose because she was angry that I disagreed with her about college." The words felt enormous in the quiet living room, like a bomb that would change the landscape permanently once it exploded. Richard's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, something that might have been recognition, and then a kind of determined denial that Maya recognized as his default response to information that threatened his sense of order and control. "Maya," Richard said slowly, "that's a very serious accusation. Are you absolutely certain that's what happened? Because what you're suggesting would mean that Diane deliberately hurt you, and I have a hard time believing that the woman I married would do something like that." Diane's eyes filled with tears that looked completely genuine, and Maya felt a familiar wave of doubt about her own perceptions. Diane was an accomplished performer, someone who could manufacture the appropriate emotional response for any situation. But the tears looked real, the hurt in her voice sounded authentic, and Maya could feel her father's sympathy shifting toward the woman who appeared to be the victim of false accusations. "Richard, I don't know what I've done to make Maya feel this way about me. I've tried so hard to be a good stepmother, to respect her relationship with you while still providing structure and guidance. But lately, she's been so hostile, so resistant to any input I try to offer, and now this." She gestured toward the papers on the coffee table. "It feels like she's trying to destroy our family." Maya watched her father's face as he listened to Diane, and she could see him constructing a narrative that made sense within his worldview. Maya was a teenager dealing with the stress of college applications and the lingering grief over her mother's death. Diane was a woman trying to blend two families while managing her own adjustment to marriage and step-parenting. The conflict between them was unfortunate, but understandable, and surely it could be resolved through better communication and mutual effort. "Maya," Richard said, "I think we need to take a step back here.
You've been under a lot of stress lately, and I know the college application process has been overwhelming. But accusing Diane of deliberately hurting you is a line we can't cross. These are the kinds of accusations that can destroy families, that can have serious legal consequences. Are you really sure this isn't just a misunderstanding that's gotten blown out of proportion? Maya felt the familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath her feet, the way conversations in this house had a tendency to reorganize themselves around Diane's comfort rather than Maya's safety. Her dad wasn't asking whether she was telling the truth. He was asking whether she was willing to modify her truth to preserve family harmony. Dad, I know how this sounds. I know it's easier to believe that I'm confused or stressed or making things up. But look at the medical report. Dr. Martinez explained exactly what kind of injury this is and how it happens. She said it's consistent with deliberate force, not an accident. Richard picked up the medical paperwork and read through it with the careful attention he brought to contracts and legal documents. Maya watched his face as he processed the technical language, the specific medical terminology that described the damage to Maya's cervical vertebrae. "This is concerning," Richard admitted. "But Maya, doctors make mistakes. They see patterns where there might not be any. And sometimes people in certain professions are trained to look for problems that might not actually exist." Diane moved closer to Richard's chair, placing her hand on his shoulder in a gesture that looked supportive, but that Maya recognized as territorial. "Richard, I think what's happening here is that Maya is going through a very difficult time, and she's looking for someone to blame for all the stress and confusion she's feeling. I understand that. I really do. But I can't let her destroy our family with false accusations just because she's struggling emotionally." Maya realized that she was watching a masterclass in manipulation. Diane was positioning herself as the reasonable adult concerned about Maya's emotional well-being, while simultaneously discrediting Maya's account of events. She was expressing understanding and compassion while making it clear that Maya's version of reality was unacceptable and potentially destructive. "I'm not trying to destroy our family," Maya said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "I'm trying to tell you what really happened to me. I'm trying to get help because I don't feel safe in this house. And instead of listening to me, you're both acting like I'm the problem for talking about it." The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt different, charged with the recognition that they had moved beyond the possibility of easy resolution. Maya had stated her position clearly, and her father and stepmother had made it equally clear that they weren't prepared to accept her version of events. Tommy appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of raised voices. At 14, he had learned to recognize the warning signs of family conflict, but he had also learned that staying neutral was the safest position for him to maintain. Maya could see the confusion in his expression as he took in the scene, the paper spread across the coffee table, the tension radiating from all three adults, the sense that something significant was happening that he didn't fully understand. "What's going on?" Tommy asked, his voice uncertain. "Just some family business we need to work through. Why don't you go upstairs and work on your homework? We'll be done here soon." But Tommy didn't move. He looked at Maya, then at Diane, then back at Maya. "Are you okay?" he asked his half-sister. "You look upset." Maya felt a surge of gratitude for Tommy's genuine concern, even as she recognized that involving him in this conflict could potentially put him in danger. If Diane was willing to hurt Maya when she felt threatened or challenged, there was no guarantee that Tommy's favored status would protect him indefinitely. "I'm not trying to destroy our family," Maya said, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. "I'm trying to tell you what really happened to me. I'm trying to get help because I don't feel safe in this house. And instead of listening to me, you're both acting like I'm the problem for talking about it." Diane waited until she was sure Tommy was out of earshot, then turned back to Maya with an expression that had shifted from hurt confusion to something harder and more calculating. "Maya, I think you need to understand something. This family was doing just fine before you started creating drama and making accusations. Richard and I are happy together, Tommy is thriving, and we have built something good here. If you continue down this path, if you keep trying to involve outsiders in our private family business, you're going to force us to make some very difficult decisions. The threat was delivered in the same calm tone that Diane used for discussing dinner plans or weekend schedules, but Maya understood its implications perfectly. She was being told that her choice was between accepting the family's version of reality or facing consequences that would isolate her even further. Richard looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken, but he didn't intervene. Maya realized that her father's discomfort wasn't necessarily with Diane's tactics, but with the fact that those tactics were being deployed so openly. He preferred his family conflicts to be managed more subtly, with less explicit acknowledgement of the power dynamics at play.
What kind of decisions? Maya asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Well, Diane said, settling into the chair across from Maya with the air of someone who had given this considerable thought. If you're really so unhappy here, if you really feel that Richard and I are such terrible guardians, then maybe it would be better for everyone if you had some space to think about what you really want. There are boarding schools that specialize in helping troubled teenagers work through their emotional problems. There are therapeutic programs that might help you process your grief over your mother's death in a healthier way. Maya felt the room spin slightly as she processed what Diane was suggesting. The threat wasn't just about invalidating Maya's account of the abuse. It was about removing her from the house entirely, separating her from her father and half-brother, reframing her desire for safety as evidence of mental instability that required professional intervention. "You want to send me away?" Maya said flatly. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "I want what's best for you," Diane replied smoothly, "and clearly our current living situation isn't working. You're unhappy, you're making serious accusations against people who love you, and you're creating an environment where Tommy has to witness conflict and tension instead of experiencing the stable family life he deserves." Maya looked at her father, hoping to see some indication that he would reject this plan, that he would prioritize keeping his daughter close over maintaining domestic tranquility. But Richard was staring at his hands, and Maya realized that he was actually considering Diane's suggestion as a reasonable solution to an intractable problem. "Dad," Maya said, "you're not seriously thinking about sending me away because I reported that Diane hurt me?" Richard looked up, and Maya could see the genuine pain in his expression. He was trapped between competing loyalties, unable to reconcile his love for Maya with his attachment to Diane, unwilling to accept that the woman he had married might be capable of the behavior Maya was describing. "Maya, I don't want to send you anywhere," Richard said slowly, "but I also can't have this level of conflict in our house. If you really believe that Diane hurt you deliberately, then maybe some professional counseling would help us figure out how to move forward. And if that counseling happens to take place in a residential setting, that might give everyone some space to cool down and gain perspective." Maya realized that her father had already accepted Diane's framing of the situation. In his mind, the problem wasn't Diane's behavior, it was Maya's response to that behavior. The solution wasn't to address the abuse, but to remove Maya from the situation, while reframing her departure as therapeutic intervention rather than family abandonment. "So, if I tell the truth about what happened to me, you'll send me away? And if I agree to pretend it was an accident, I can stay? Is that what you're telling me?" Neither Richard nor Diane answered directly, but their silence was confirmation enough. Maya was being presented with a choice between her integrity and her family, between her safety and her stability, between being believed and being loved.
The social worker that Dr. Martinez had mentioned suddenly felt less like an abstract resource and more like a concrete necessity. Maya realized that she was going to need advocates who weren't emotionally invested in maintaining the fiction of family harmony, people who were trained to recognize manipulation and intimidation tactics, professionals who understood that keeping families together wasn't always the right answer when safety was at stake. "I need some time to think," Maya said finally. Diane's smile returned, the warm expression of someone who believed she had successfully navigated a potential crisis. "Of course, sweetheart, this is a lot to process, but I hope you'll consider what's really best for everyone, including yourself." Maya gathered the papers from the coffee table, noting how Diane's posture relaxed as the evidence of Maya's medical situation disappeared from view. Out of sight, out of mind. That seemed to be the family's preferred approach to managing inconvenient truths.
As Maya headed upstairs to her room, she could hear Richard and Diane beginning a quiet conversation that she wasn't meant to overhear. She caught fragments, discussions about teenage rebellion and professional help, and what's best for everyone involved. They were constructing a narrative that would allow them to maintain their self-image as caring parents while removing the source of discomfort from their daily lives. In her bedroom, Maya sat on her bed and looked at the medical paperwork that documented her injury. Dr. Martinez had been right. This wasn't the kind of damage that resulted from accidents or misunderstandings. Maya's neck bore the physical evidence of intentional harm, regardless of what her family chose to believe about the circumstances that caused it. Maya picked up her phone and found the business card that Dr. Martinez had given her. The social services advocate would be available until 6 p.m., which gave Maya about an hour to decide whether she was ready to take the next step in a process that would almost certainly mean the end of the family structure she had known for the past 5 years. She thought about Tommy upstairs, probably wondering what had caused the tension he had witnessed. She thought about her father, genuinely believing that he was acting in everyone's best interest. She thought about Diane, who had successfully positioned herself as the victim of a disturbed teenager's accusations rather than the perpetrator of deliberate harm. But mostly, Maya thought about her mother, who had taught her that speaking truth was a moral obligation, even when it was difficult, even when it was costly, even when it made other people uncomfortable. Elena Chen had been a social worker who understood the difference between keeping families together and keeping families safe, and Maya was beginning to understand that honoring her mother's memory might require her to choose safety over togetherness. Maya dialed the number on the business card, her hands shaking slightly as she waited for someone to answer. When a calm, professional voice responded with, "Family Services, this is Jennifer speaking," Maya took a deep breath and began the conversation that would change the trajectory of her life. "Hi, my name is Maya Chen, and Dr. Martinez at the radiology clinic said I should call you. I think I need help." Jennifer Caldwell arrived at Maya's high school the next morning with the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of navigating complex family situations where the stakes are measured in children's safety rather than adults' comfort. Maya had never met a social worker before, but she recognized something familiar in Jennifer's direct gaze and careful attention, the same quality she had seen in Dr. Martinez, the ability to listen to difficult truths without flinching or rushing to minimize their impact. They met in the guidance counselor's office, a space that Maya had always associated with college planning and schedule changes, but that now felt like a sanctuary where she could speak freely without calculating the potential consequences of every word. Jennifer had brought a folder thick with forms and resources, but she didn't immediately dive into paperwork. Instead, she asked Maya to tell her story from the beginning, with as much detail as she could remember. "I know you've had to repeat this multiple times already," Jennifer said, settling into her chair with the patience of someone who understood that rushing traumatized teenagers was counterproductive. "But I need to hear it in your own words, and I need you to know that everything you tell me will be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly." Maya began with the night of the injury, but Jennifer gently encouraged her to go further back, to describe the pattern of behavior that had led up to that moment.
As Maya talked about the gradual erosion of her sense of safety in her own home, about the careful choreography required to avoid Diane's anger, about the way her family had dismissed her concerns as teenage drama, she watched Jennifer take notes without judgment or skepticism. "Tell me about the conversation you had with your father and stepmother yesterday," Jennifer said when Maya reached that part of her story.
Maya described the confrontation, the way Diane had positioned herself as the victim of false accusations, the threat of being sent away to a residential program if she continued to create drama with her version of events. As she spoke, Maya could see Jennifer's expression growing more serious, her note-taking becoming more detailed. "Maya," Jennifer said when Maya finished, "what you're describing is a textbook pattern of abuse and intimidation. The physical injury was serious enough, but the psychological manipulation you've experienced, the gaslighting, the threats of removal from your home, the isolation from support systems, these are tactics that abusers use to maintain control over their victims." Hearing a trained professional use the word abuse to describe her situation felt like another piece of validation clicking into place. Maya had begun to doubt her own perceptions after months of being told that her reactions were disproportionate, that her concerns were unfounded, that her desire for safety was actually evidence of ingratitude and emotional instability. "What happens now?" Maya asked. Jennifer explained the investigation process: interviews with family members, examination of medical records, assessment of Maya's safety, evaluation of the home environment. She also explained Maya's options, which ranged from family counseling and safety planning to temporary placement with relatives or foster care if the investigation determined that Maya was at risk of further harm. "The goal," Jennifer said, "is always to keep families together when it's safe to do so. But safety is the priority, and if your stepmother has been physically and emotionally abusing you, then changes need to be made to ensure that you're protected." Maya felt a mixture of relief and terror as she contemplated the possibility of real intervention in her situation. For months, she had felt like she was drowning in a sea of denial and minimization, and now someone with actual authority was throwing her a life preserver. But she also understood that accepting that help would mean triggering a process that would fundamentally alter her family structure and potentially isolate her from the only stability she had known since her mother's death. Jennifer seemed to understand Maya's conflicted feelings. "I know this is scary," she said. "Change is always frightening, especially when you're already dealing with trauma and loss. But Maya, what you've described to me isn't a normal family conflict that can be resolved through better communication. This is a pattern of abuse that will likely escalate if it's not addressed." The word escalate sent a chill through Maya's chest. She thought about Diane's reaction to being confronted with the medical evidence, the way her stepmother's mask had slipped to reveal something colder and more calculating than Maya had seen before. She thought about the threat of being sent away, the implication that Maya's continued presence in the house was conditional on her willingness to accept Diane's version of reality. "When will you talk to my dad and Diane?" Maya asked. "This afternoon. I'll be conducting interviews with all the adults in your household, and I'll also be speaking with your brother to get a sense of the overall family dynamics. I know that feels intrusive and uncomfortable, but it's necessary for me to get a complete picture of what's been happening." Maya's phone buzzed with a text message from her father. "Need to talk to you after school. Please come straight home. Love you." The message was signed with his usual affection, but Maya could read the underlying tension in the instruction to come directly home rather than lingering at school or stopping anywhere else. Jennifer noticed Maya's expression as she read the message. "What is it?" Maya showed her, and Jennifer's frown deepened. "Maya, I need you to understand something important. Your family is going to be notified about this investigation before I arrive for the interviews this afternoon. That's required by law. They have the right to know what allegations have been made and what the investigation process will involve." But that also means they're going to have several hours to prepare their responses and potentially to pressure you to change your story.
The implications of this hit Maya like a physical blow. She had been operating under the assumption that she would have some time to prepare mentally for the confrontation with her family. But instead, she was going to face them with the knowledge that their entire world was about to be scrutinized by outside authorities. "Are you safe going home today?" Jennifer asked directly. Maya considered the question seriously. Was she safe? She had been living in a state of hypervigilance for months, carefully managing her interactions with Diane to minimize the risk of triggering another violent episode. But now that Diane knew about the medical report, about Maya's contact with social services, about the investigation that was about to begin, all of Maya's careful risk management strategies might be irrelevant. "I don't know," Maya admitted. I think Diane is going to be really angry. And when she gets angry, she doesn't always control herself." Jennifer made another note, then looked up at Maya with the expression of someone who was making a significant decision. "Maya, I'm going to arrange for you to stay somewhere else tonight. Do you have any relatives in the area who might be able to take you temporarily?" Maya thought about her mother's sister, Aunt Linda, who lived about an hour away and who had maintained sporadic contact with Maya despite Diane's subtle discouragement of those relationships. Linda was a pediatric nurse who had expressed concern about Maya's withdrawal and apparent stress during their infrequent visits, but Maya had always deflected her aunt's questions with vague explanations about normal teenage adjustment issues. "My aunt might be able to help," Maya said, "but she doesn't know about any of this. I've been pretending everything was fine when I saw her." "That's very common," Jennifer said gently. "Victims of abuse often feel pressure to protect their abusers and maintain family secrets, especially when they're afraid that telling the truth will make their situation worse. But Maya, your aunt is going to want to help you, and she's going to be glad that you're finally getting the support you need." Jennifer helped Maya call Linda from the school office, and Maya found herself crying as she tried to explain the situation to her aunt without revealing too many details over the phone. Linda's response was immediate and unequivocal. Of course Maya could stay with her for as long as necessary, and Linda would be at the school within the hour to pick her up. "Honey," Linda said, her voice thick with emotion, "I knew something was wrong. I could see it in your eyes every time we got together, but I didn't know how to ask without making things worse for you. I'm so sorry you've been dealing with this alone." Maya felt a wave of grief for all the months she had spent isolated and afraid, believing that she had no options and no allies. Her mother's family had been there all along, waiting to help. But Diane had been so effective at creating distance between Maya and her extended support network that Maya had forgotten she had people who loved her unconditionally. While they waited for Linda to arrive, Jennifer explained what would happen next. She would conduct the family interviews as scheduled, but Maya's absence from the house would send a clear message about the seriousness of the situation. The investigation would continue regardless of the family's cooperation, and the physical evidence from Maya's medical examination would be a crucial factor in determining the outcome. "Maya, I want you to understand that you've done exactly the right thing by speaking up. It took courage to report what happened to you, and it's going to take continued courage to see this process through. But you're not alone anymore, and you're not responsible for managing your family's emotional reactions to the truth." Maya's father called during lunch, and Jennifer advised her not to answer. Richard called 3 more times before Jennifer finally had Maya send a text message explaining that she was safe but would not be coming home that day. The response was immediate and anguished, a series of texts asking where she was, what was happening, whether she was being influenced by people who didn't understand their family situation. Linda arrived at the school looking like an older version of Maya's mother, with the same determined expression that Elena had worn when she was advocating for her client's children. She hugged Maya tightly, then shook Jennifer's hand with the brisk efficiency of someone who was already mentally preparing to provide whatever support her niece might need. "What can I do to help?" Linda asked Jennifer directly.
Jennifer explained the investigation timeline and the importance of providing Maya with a stable environment where she could process what had happened without pressure to reconcile with her family before it was safe to do so. Linda nodded, asking practical questions about school transportation, therapy resources, and legal advocacy options. Maya watched this conversation with a sense of surreal relief. For the first time in months, the adults in her life were discussing her safety and well-being without simultaneously calculating the impact on family harmony or Richard's happiness. Linda's primary concern was Maya's physical and emotional health, not the preservation of relationships that had become toxic and dangerous. That evening, sitting in Linda's kitchen while her aunt made tea and heated up leftover soup, Maya finally allowed herself to acknowledge how exhausted she had become from the constant vigilance required to navigate life in her father's house. Linda's home felt peaceful in a way that Maya had almost forgotten was possible. No underlying tension, no need to monitor the emotional temperature of every interaction, no careful calculation required before speaking or moving through shared spaces. "Your mom would be so proud of you," Linda said as they sat at the kitchen table with their tea. Elena always said that speaking truth was the hardest and most important work that people could do, especially when that truth challenged powerful people who wanted to keep things quiet. Maya felt her mother's presence in the room, not as a ghostly visitation, but as a reminder of the values and strength that Elena had tried to instill in her daughter. Elena had spent her career advocating for children who couldn't advocate for themselves, and Maya was beginning to understand that learning to advocate for herself was a way of honoring her mother's legacy. Linda's phone rang around 8 p.m., and Maya could hear Richard's voice on the other end requesting to speak with Maya, explaining that there had been misunderstandings that needed to be cleared up, insisting that the family could work through this together without involving outside agencies. Linda listened patiently, then responded with the clear authority of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. "Richard, I love you like a brother-in-law, and I know you're a good man who wants what's best for Maya. But what's best for Maya right now is safety and space to heal from what she's been through. When the investigation is complete, when professionals have determined that it's safe for her to return home, then we can talk about reunification. Until then, she stays with me." Maya could hear Richard's voice rising in frustration, demanding to know what lies Maya had pulled, insisting that Diane was being crucified for an innocent accident, threatening to call lawyers and file custody motions. Linda's responses remained calm and consistent. Maya was safe, the investigation would proceed as required by law, and all decisions about Maya's future would be made with her best interests as the primary consideration. After Linda hung up, she sat back down at the table and looked at Maya with gentle eyes. "That wasn't easy to hear, but it confirms what you've told me about the family dynamics. Your father is more concerned about protecting Diane's reputation than he is about your safety, and that tells me everything I need to know about whether you made the right choice in speaking up." Maya felt a complex mixture of sadness and validation as she processed Linda's observation. Part of her still wanted to believe that her father would eventually prioritize her well-being over his relationship with Diane, but the phone conversation had made it clear that Richard was committed to the narrative that positioned Maya as the problem rather than Diane as the perpetrator. What if the investigation doesn't find enough evidence? What if they decide I'm just a troubled teenager making false accusations? Linda reached across the table and took Maya's hands in hers. "Honey, you have medical evidence that supports your account. You have professional witnesses who have documented their concerns. And now you have family members who are willing to provide you with safe housing while this gets sorted out. The truth has a way of emerging when enough people are paying attention." That night, Maya slept in her mother's childhood bedroom, surrounded by books that Elena had loved and photographs that captured a time when her family had been defined by love rather than fear. For the first time in months, Maya didn't lie awake calculating the next day's potential conflicts or listening for sounds that might indicate danger approaching her room. Instead, she slept deeply and dreamlessly, The kind of sleep that comes when the body finally believes it's safe enough to let down its guard. When she woke the next morning, Maya felt like she was emerging from a long period of holding her breath, finally able to fill her lungs completely and begin the work of healing from wounds that were deeper and more extensive than she had allowed herself to acknowledge. Jennifer called that morning to update Maya on the previous day's interviews. Richard had been cooperative but defensive, repeatedly emphasizing Diane's positive qualities and suggesting that Maya was struggling with unresolved grief that was affecting her perception of family interactions. Diane had been calm and articulate, expressing concern for Maya's emotional well-being while maintaining that the neck injury was an unfortunate accident that had been blown out of proportion. Tommy's interview had been the most revealing. Away from his parents' influence, he had described walking on eggshells around Diane, witnessing her explosive anger when she thought no one was watching, observing the way Maya had become quieter and more withdrawn over the past year. He confirmed that he had heard the argument the night Maya was injured, that it had sounded really bad, and that he had been afraid to come downstairs because Diane's voice had sounded scary. Tommy's account corroborates your version of events, Jennifer told Maya. He's also expressed concern about what might happen to him if you don't come home, which suggests that he's been aware of problematic dynamics in the house, even though he hasn't been directly targeted. Maya felt a stab of guilt about leaving Tommy in a situation that might become more difficult for him in her absence, but Jennifer was quick to address her concern. Maya, you can't protect Tommy by staying in an abusive situation. The best way to help him is to ensure that this pattern of behavior is addressed professionally so that it doesn't escalate to the point where he becomes a target as well. The investigation would continue for several more days, with additional interviews, home visits, and consultations with medical professionals. Maya would remain with Linda during this time, attending school from her aunt's house and meeting regularly with a trauma counselor who specialized in working with teenagers who had experienced family violence. Dr. Martinez called that afternoon to check on Maya and to provide additional medical documentation that supported the investigation. She had consulted with colleagues who specialized in forensic medicine, and their consensus was that Maya's injury pattern was consistent with intentional harm rather than accidental contact. I'm proud of you for speaking up, Dr. Martinez told Maya. I know it wasn't easy, and I know the process ahead won't be easy either. But you've started something that needed to be started, and you've given the adults in your life the opportunity to do their jobs properly, to protect you instead of protecting the person who hurt you. Maya was beginning to understand that her decision to call Jennifer had been the beginning of a much larger story, not just her own healing and recovery, but a reckoning with family dynamics that had been toxic for much longer than she had initially recognized. The investigation was revealing patterns of manipulation and control that had affected everyone in the household, creating an environment where Tommy learned to hide, and Richard learned to minimize, and Maya learned to accept increasingly unacceptable treatment as the price of maintaining family stability. But it was also revealing something else: the strength of the support network that had been waiting for Maya to reach out, the competence of systems designed to protect children when their own families couldn't or wouldn't do so, and Maya's own capacity to survive and speak truth, even when doing so required enormous courage. As Maya settled into her temporary life at Linda's house, she began to glimpse the possibility of a future where her safety and well-being were prioritized, where her voice was heard and believed, where she could focus on healing and growth rather than survival and appeasement. It was a future that would require her to grieve, not just for the family she had lost through her mother's death, but the family she had hoped to rebuild with her father and stepmother, a hope that had sustained her through months of diminishing returns and escalating harm. But it was also a future where she could honor her mother's memory by living with integrity and courage, where she could rebuild relationships based on mutual respect rather than power imbalances, and where she could use her experience to help other young people who might be struggling in similar situations. Maya was beginning to understand that healing from trauma wasn't just about returning to a previous state of wholeness, but about growing into a new version of herself that incorporated the wisdom gained through surviving something that should never have happened to her in the first place. 6 months after Maya first walked into Dr. Martinez's radiology office, she stood in a courthouse listening to a family court judge deliver a decision that would reshape her life permanently. The investigation had revealed not just the incident that injured Maya's neck, but a documented pattern of psychological abuse, financial control, and systematic isolation that Diane had imposed on the household with increasing intensity over the past 2 years. Richard sat 3 rows behind Maya, his face a mask of controlled grief that spoke to the complicated emotions of a man who had finally been forced to confront the reality of what his marriage had cost his daughter. Diane was not present. She had moved out of the family home 2 months earlier when the protective order was issued, and her lawyer had advised her not to attend the custody hearing that would determine Maya's permanent living situation. Judge Patricia Henley, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and eyes that suggested she had presided over too many cases where children's safety had been compromised by adults' poor choices, read through the court's findings with the methodical precision that legal proceedings demanded. The medical evidence was clear and convincing. The testimony from multiple witnesses, Maya, Tommy, school personnel who had noticed changes in Maya's behavior, and neighbors who had reported hearing heated arguments from the Chen household, painted a consistent picture of escalating domestic violence. The court finds, Judge Henley said, her voice carrying across the small courtroom, that Maya Chen has been subjected to physical and emotional abuse by her stepmother, Diane Chen, and that the respondent father, Richard Chen, while not directly perpetrating abuse, failed in his duty to protect his minor child from harm. The court further finds that Maya's allegations have been substantiated by medical evidence, witness testimony, and the professional assessment of trained social workers and psychologists. Maya felt Linda's hands squeeze hers as they listened to the legal validation of everything Maya had experienced and reported. Sitting beside them was Dr. Sarah Martinez, who had taken time from her radiology practice to attend the hearing as a witness, and Jennifer Caldwell, whose thorough investigation had uncovered layers of manipulation and control that extended far beyond the night when Diane had injured Maya's neck. The judge continued, outlining the court's decision regarding Maya's custody and living arrangements. Maya would remain with Linda permanently, with Richard granted supervised visitation rights that could be expanded over time if he demonstrated a commitment to understanding the harm that had occurred and to rebuilding a relationship with his daughter based on her safety and well-being rather than his own emotional needs. Tommy, now 15 and more outspoken than he had been during the initial investigation, had also been granted the option to live with Linda if he chose to do so. The court had found that while Tommy had not been directly abused, he had been living in an environment where violence was normalized and where speaking up about concerning behavior was discouraged, conditions that posed a risk to his emotional and psychological development. "I want to stay with Dad," Tommy had told the court-appointed guardian during his interview, "but I also want Maya to come home. And if she can't come home because of Diane, then I don't want Diane to come back either." Tommy's statement had been one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the case, demonstrating that even the family member who had been most protected from Diane's abuse understood that Maya's safety had been compromised and that changes needed to be made to ensure everyone's well-being. Richard had made the difficult decision to divorce Diane after the investigation revealed the extent of her manipulative behavior. The process had been painful for him, requiring him to acknowledge that the woman he loved had been systematically harming his daughter while presenting herself as a victim of teenage rebellion and family dysfunction. The divorce proceedings had also revealed financial irregularities. Diane had been gradually moving money from Richard's accounts into accounts that only she controlled, apparently preparing for the possibility that her behavior would eventually be exposed and she would need to leave quickly. In the months following the protective order, Richard had begun therapy with a counselor who specialized in helping parents rebuild relationships with children who had been harmed while under their care. The process was slow and often frustrating for Richard, who wanted to return to the close relationship he had enjoyed with Maya before Diane entered their lives, but who was learning that healing required more than good intentions and apologies. "I keep thinking that if I just explain how sorry I am, how much I love Maya, that we can go back to the way things were," Richard told his therapist during one particularly difficult session. But Maya needs me to understand that I can't erase what happened by being sorry about it. She needs me to understand why it happened and how I'm going to make sure it never happens again. Maya's therapy had followed a different trajectory. Working with Dr. Rebecca Torres, a trauma specialist who had extensive experience with adolescent survivors of family violence, Maya was learning to distinguish between her own thoughts and feelings and the narratives that Diane had imposed on her through months of gaslighting and manipulation. Abuse changes the way we think about ourselves and our relationships, Dr. Torres explained during one of their sessions. Abusers are very skilled at making their victims believe that they're responsible for the abuse, that they deserve it somehow, or that they're being overly sensitive or dramatic when they object to harmful treatment. Recovery involves rebuilding your ability to trust your own perceptions and to value your own well-being. One of the most challenging aspects of Maya's recovery was learning to navigate her relationship with her father without carrying the responsibility for his emotional well-being. For years, Maya had been conditioned to believe that her father's happiness was partially dependent on her willingness to accommodate Diane's behavior, to minimize her own needs, and to present a united family front regardless of what was happening behind closed doors. It's not your job to manage your father's guilt or grief about what happened, Dr. Torres reminded Maya repeatedly. Adults are responsible for their own emotional responses to the consequences of their choices. Your job is to heal and to rebuild your sense of self on a foundation of safety and self-respect. Maya's relationship with Tommy had evolved as well. Initially, Tommy had been angry with Maya for breaking up the family. But family therapy sessions had helped him understand that Maya hadn't created the problems in their household. She had simply stopped pretending that those problems didn't exist. Tommy had chosen to remain with Richard, but he visited Maya and Linda regularly, and their sibling relationship had grown stronger as they learned to talk openly about their experiences, rather than maintaining the careful silence that had characterized their interactions while Diane was in the house. "I used to think you were just being difficult," Tommy told Maya during one of their visits. "But then I realized that I was walking on eggshells around Diane too. I just never admitted it to myself because it was easier to believe that you were the problem." The legal proceedings had concluded with Diane pleading non-contest to charges of assault and harassment. She had been sentenced to anger management counseling, community service, and 5 years of probation that included provisions preventing her from contacting Maya or Tommy directly. Diane had also been required to pay restitution for Maya's medical expenses and therapy costs, acknowledging financial responsibility for the harm she had caused.
Speaking at the sentencing could be empowering for some survivors, but for others, it's just another way of being asked to manage other people's understanding of their experience. Maya had channeled her energy into advocacy work that felt meaningful and healing for her specifically. She had begun volunteering with a local organization that provided support services for teenagers experiencing family violence, using her own story to help other young people recognize that they deserved safety and that speaking up about abuse wasn't betrayal, it was self-preservation. Maya's college plans had been delayed by a year, but this had turned out to be a blessing rather than a setback. The gap year had given her time to heal, to rebuild her sense of identity outside of survival mode, and to approach her future from a place of strength rather than desperation to escape her circumstances. She had been accepted to several journalism programs, and she had decided to attend a school that offered strong programs in both investigative reporting and social work, fields that would allow her to combine her natural talents for writing and research with her passion for advocacy and justice. Linda had become not just Maya's guardian, but her mentor and emotional anchor. As a pediatric nurse, Linda understood the long-term effects of childhood trauma, and she had created a home environment that prioritized Maya's healing without making her feel like a patient or a project to be fixed. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you're becoming," Linda told Maya on the anniversary of the night she had called Jennifer for help. And Lena always believed that surviving difficult experiences could make people stronger and more compassionate, but only if they had support and space to process what happened to them properly. Maya had reconnected with many of the interests and friendships that she had gradually abandoned during the months when Diane's presence had made her world smaller and more constrained. She had rejoined the debate team, resumed her work with the school newspaper, and even begun dating, something that had felt impossible when she was living in a state of constant hypervigilance. Her relationship with Jessica had deepened as Maya learned to be honest about what she had experienced, rather than maintaining the careful facade that had characterized their friendship during the worst period of the abuse. Jessica's family had become an extended support network for Maya, providing her with examples of how healthy families handled conflict and disagreement without resorting to intimidation or manipulation. "I feel like I'm getting to know the real Maya for the first time," Jessica told her during one of their conversations about Maya's recovery process. "Not that I didn't care about you before, but you were so careful all the time. Like you were afraid that being yourself might cause problems for someone else." Maya's relationship with her father remained complicated and was likely to require years of careful rebuilding. Richard had made significant changes in his life, completing his own therapy, learning about domestic violence dynamics, and developing a better understanding of how his desire to maintain family harmony had inadvertently enabled Diane's abusive behavior. Their supervised visits had gradually expanded to include overnight stays and holiday celebrations, but Maya set clear boundaries about the topics they could discuss and the expectations she had for their relationship moving forward. Richard was learning to respect these boundaries without taking them as personal rejection, understanding that Maya's need for control over their interactions was a natural consequence of having had her autonomy systematically undermined for years. "I can't undo what happened," Richard had told Maya during one of their therapy sessions together, "but I can learn from it, and I can make sure that your safety and well-being are always my priority, even when that means making choices that are difficult for me personally." Maya had also maintained contact with Dr. Martinez, who had become something of a mentor and role model for Maya's own aspirations toward advocacy work. Dr. Martinez had invited Maya to speak to medical students about recognizing signs of abuse and the importance of believing patients who report concerning family dynamics.
You saved your own life by speaking up, Dr. Martinez told Maya during one of their conversations, but you've also contributed to changing the way medical professionals think about their responsibilities to patients who might be experiencing violence at home. That's a legacy that extends far beyond your own healing. The most unexpected development in Maya's recovery had been her growing relationship with her extended family on her mother's side. Diane had been successful in creating distance between Maya and Richard, convincing him that maintaining those connections was confusing for Maya and made it harder for their new family to bond properly. But living with Linda had reconnected Maya with cousins, aunts, and grandparents who had been waiting for years for an opportunity to be part of her life again. Maya had begun learning Mandarin again, cooking the recipes her mother had taught her, and exploring the cultural heritage that Diane had made her feel ashamed of claiming. Culture isn't just about food and language, Maya's grandmother explained during one of their regular video calls. It's about values, about taking care of family, about speaking truth even when it's difficult, about believing that every person deserves dignity and respect. Your mother lived those values, and now you're living them too. Maya's writing had evolved as well. Her journalism pieces had always been competent and well-researched, but now they carried an emotional depth and commitment to justice that came from personal experience with how institutions could both fail and succeed in protecting vulnerable people. She had written a series of articles for the school newspaper about recognizing domestic violence, accessing resources for survivors, and understanding the role that bystanders played in either enabling abuse or interrupting it. The series had been picked up by local media outlets and had generated conversations in her community about improving support services for teenagers experiencing family violence.
She had also begun working on a longer piece, part memoir, part investigation, about the ways that well-meaning family court systems could inadvertently prioritize family preservation over child safety, and how survivors could navigate legal processes that weren't always designed with their needs in mind. The writing was difficult, requiring Maya to revisit painful memories and emotions, but it was also empowering. She was transforming her experience from something that happened to her into something she could use to help others, creating meaning from trauma without minimizing the reality of what she had endured. Writing about trauma isn't the same as being healed from it, Dr. Torres had cautioned Maya when she began the project, but it can be part of the healing process, especially when it helps you feel like you have agency over your own story. Maya's plans for college now included the possibility of law school afterward, with a focus on family law and child advocacy. She had discovered that she had a talent for understanding complex legal processes and translating them into language that non-lawyers could understand, skills that could be valuable for helping other survivors navigate systems that often felt overwhelming and intimidating. The transformation in Maya's daily life was perhaps most visible in small moments that others might take for granted. She slept through the night without startling awake at every sound. She expressed opinions in family conversations without calculating the potential consequences. She made plans for her future that were based on her own interests and goals rather than strategies for avoiding conflict. She had learned to recognize the difference between healthy conflict that led to resolution and understanding and unhealthy conflict that was designed to establish dominance and control. She had developed the ability to disagree with people she loved without fearing that the disagreement would lead to retaliation or abandonment. Most importantly, Maya had rebuilt her relationship with her own instincts and perceptions. She trusted herself to recognize when something felt wrong, and she had developed the skills and support network necessary to address problems directly rather than enduring them silently. The anniversary of the night Maya called Jennifer for help had become a day of reflection and celebration in Linda's house. Not celebration of the trauma itself, but celebration of Maya's courage in speaking up, of the strength she had shown throughout the recovery process, and of the new life she had built on a foundation of truth and self-respect.
"A year ago, you were carrying this burden alone," Linda said, as they sat together in the garden where Maya had been planting flowers, something she had always loved but had stopped doing when Diane criticized her choices and made gardening feel like another source of potential conflict. "Now you have a whole community of people who care about your well-being, who believe your truth, and who are committed to supporting your healing and growth. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because you were brave enough to ask for help." Maya looked at the flowers she had planted, watching them grow in soil that was nourished and protected, free from the constant stress that had characterized her life during the months of abuse. She thought about the metaphor her mother had often used, that people, like plants, needed safe ground and proper care to reach their full potential. For the first time in years, Maya felt like she was growing toward her own potential, rather than simply surviving from day to day. She had a future that belonged to her, relationships based on mutual respect and care, and the knowledge that she possessed the strength and resources necessary to protect herself and help others who might be facing similar challenges. The fluorescent lights in Dr. Martinez's radiology office had seemed harsh and institutional when Maya first sat under them, afraid and in pain, clutching X-rays that she hoped might validate her experience of harm. But now Maya understood that those lights had been the beginning of illumination in a broader sense, the start of a process that would bring hidden truths into the open, expose patterns of behavior that thrived in secrecy and denial, and create space for healing that could only happen when reality was acknowledged and addressed honestly. Maya's neck had healed completely, leaving no visible scars from Diane's attack. But the invisible wounds,
The damage to her trust, her sense of safety, her relationship with her father, those would take longer to heal and would always be part of her story. Maya had learned that healing didn't mean forgetting or pretending that trauma hadn't happened. Instead, it meant integrating difficult experiences into a life story that also included joy, growth, love, and purpose. It meant understanding that survival was not just about enduring harm, but about building a future where that harm could not be repeated. As Maya prepared to leave for college, she carried with her the knowledge that speaking truth had cost her the family structure she had once known, but it had also given her something more valuable, the ability to build relationships based on honesty rather than accommodation, strength rather than appeasement, love rather than fear. Dr. Martinez had been right when she told Maya that her x-rays told a story that needed to be heard. But Maya had discovered that the medical evidence was just the beginning of a much larger story about resilience, about the importance of believing survivors, about the power of professional intervention when families fail to protect their most vulnerable members, and about the possibility of healing and growth that could emerge from even the most painful circumstances. Maya's story had become proof that breaking silence about abuse was not an act of destruction, but an act of creation. The creation of space for truth, for healing, for justice, and for the kind of love that prioritizes safety over comfort, honesty over harmony, and protection over preservation of appearances. Standing in Linda's garden on a warm spring evening, surrounded by flowers that were thriving in nourishing soil, Maya felt her mother's presence not as loss or absence, but as guidance that had led her home to herself. Elena's legacy lived on in Maya's courage to speak truth, her commitment to justice, and her understanding that surviving trauma could become a source of strength not just for herself, but for everyone whose life she would touch in the years to come. Maya had learned that she was not responsible for fixing broken systems or healing wounded adults, but she could be part of creating a world where other young people would find it easier to speak up when they were being harmed, where their voices would be heard and believed more quickly, and where the cost of breaking silence about abuse would be shared by entire communities rather than borne by survivors alone. The radiologist had become Maya's voice when she could not find words for her own pain. But Maya had discovered that her voice had always been there, waiting for safe ground and proper support to help it grow strong enough to speak her truth and change her world.